Okay, this is a Prescott City Council workshop meeting. Today is Tuesday. Which one? I use it here. Is that you?
I think this, I don't know.
There you go. We're not used to these seating arrangements. But this is Tuesday, July 19th. This will be a joint meeting between the Prescott City Council and the Prescott Planning and Zoning Commission. So I suppose we could start with a roll call.
Mayor Good.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Rusing.
Here.
Councilwoman Hall.
Present.
Councilman Montoya.
Here.
Councilman Moore.
Here.
Councilman Sischka.
Here.
And I will notate when Councilman Tenney arrives, he did let us know that he's going to be late. Commissioner Michaelman.
Here.
Commissioner Gambogi.
Present.
Commissioner Graham.
Here.
Commissioner Hutchinson.
I'm here.
Commissioner Riley.
Here.
Commissioner Tracy.
Here.
And the record will reflect that Commissioner Goligoski is excused from the meeting.
Well, very good. We certainly have a quorum of both groups. So we will then move on to the discussion of the topic that we're considering today.
Thank you, Mayor and Planning Commissioners and Council.
I suppose we probably ought to read it. So we're going to discuss the creation and implementation of a new protective airport vicinity overlay district in the Land Development Code.
Thank you very much. We affectionately call the airport vicinity overlay an AVO. In case you hear us use acronyms, we're acronym sensitive in the planning division, so we're trying to explain them when we use them. AVO is the acronym that sets out that it's an overlay district and that it's in the vicinity of the airport. A little history on zoning will come first, followed by some fairly significant information about airport protections that are in place or that are necessary. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps after this process at the end of the presentation. One of the things that, because some of this is complex, if you have an immediate question and it's something you need answered to understand what we're doing, we invite you to ask that question. If you can hold questions to the end for a more consolidated approach, we would welcome that as well. So we can be flexible. I know planning commissioners tend to shoot questions at me as if out of a shotgun. So a little case history on zoning, but I'm actually going to deviate from the slides first thing. This is not a good sign. We've done a lot of archaeology throughout the world on very ancient sites. There's a city in southern Pakistan called Mohenjo-Daro that's about 5,500 years old. The property is laid out in a grid pattern of streets, and there's evidence from archaeology of various parts of it that uses were segregated to different areas. The market was in one place, the residence is in another, the manufacturing area where bronze tools and implements were made in a different area. So for 5,500 years, we've had at least the concept of zoning when we create properties. They separated uses out. The first comprehensive zoning code adopted in the United States was in New York City, and it was a health code requirement. There were a lot of issues associated with health of residents in very compact situations where people are living in very tight quarters, and immediately adjacent to it is a butcher shop or a pig farm or something that would not be considered compatible today, and they determined in those days, in fact, it wasn't compatible. Health problems were alleviated somewhat by requiring the separation of these uses, so an incompatible use was moved away from other uses that were incompatible with it. That was one of the first written examples in the United States. A few years later, in 1926, the village of Euclid, Ohio, enacted a zoning code. The zoning code was a layered code, kind of like ours, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. They were immediately challenged, and that challenge turned into a fight that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's findings were that because zoning is based on health, safety, and welfare, we're protecting people from things or from one another or from uses that are not compatible, that it was a police power of the state. Local governments, state governments, federal governments could enact zoning regulations and carry out enforcement of them just like they could prohibit murder, require traffic speed limits, and any of the other things that we do. It's a police power. That gives you a lot of authority that you might not have if it were some other type of authority. But the Village of Euclid, Ohio in 1926 is the reason why that carries through with zoning, and nearly every community, every city in the country has a zoning ordinance. There are few odd exceptions. Village of Euclid's code was a cumulative code. That's one like ours. It allows more uses the further away from single family you get. In their case, they had 3 different district types. In our case, we have a number, but single family allows the least number of uses. It's the most protected zoning. As you work your way up towards business, in our case, business regional being more or less our most intensive commercial use, all of the uses below it are allowed. And this is, again, patterned after the Village of Euclid's zoning. And in fact, this style of zoning is called Euclidean because of the Village of Euclid. Least number of uses in the most protected, most number of uses in the least protected. Most zoning, Euclidean zoning specifically, but most zoning is applied in the form of a 2-dimensional pattern. Properties are designated, they're marked out, it's laid out on a map. People can see the map, they can look at it, they can tell what's allowed in which district, they can see where the district boundaries are. That is a very typical zoning approach, and nearly every zoning in the country uses this. What we're talking about today is an overlay district, and an overlay district is something that doesn't necessarily follow those same patterns that we looked at in the previous picture. In each of these, what's designated as BG, which is business general, again, we're working on acronyms, sorry, it's a map. Only BG uses are allowed within the BG zone, and only multifamily uses are allowed in the multifamily zone. Now, this, of course, is subject to the uses that are permitted in that district. So in the BG zone, you can do multifamily. Each of the uses are segregated. An overlay district sits on top of this map, covering a larger area with some reason for a geographic, what's the right word for it, delineation. And it applies standards that are above and beyond any that are applied here. In fact, it applies standards that overwrite those standards of the districts beneath it if there's a conflict between the two. So it has a superior position in the effect of it on the land uses and requirements within a district. So again, we're talking about creating an overlay district in the vicinity of the airport that will apply regulations that are above and beyond those that are applied by the underlying districts for protection of the airport specifically. And that's something that's laid out in the form of an ordinance that you will all see eventually that would set out specific criteria, some of which will match what's in the existing codes, and some of it will overwrite what's in the existing codes for those areas.
You have a new room, you should get a clue. Okay. Brenda's just called. Okay.
I haven't a clue. I'm sorry. Was that Vladimir? No, never mind.
An overlay voice.
It was an overlay for my discussion. Usually these districts are applied because of a particular area. We have a commercial corridor overlays over 2 of our major roadways where we have lots of commercial uses. That commercial corridor is designed to protect the commercial use. It's also in recognition of the fact that those corridors are gateways into town, so there's criteria for what the buildings look like and screening things. We have them along waterways in many cities. We don't really have one here. We have them existing around the airport right now. We have an airport noise overlay that's associated with noise boundaries in the vicinity of the airport. It only addresses noise effectively. It has a few other pieces that we're copying across into the proposed code, but it's not effective for protecting the airport. And this overlay concept will allow us to create something that's a bigger area, more protecting of the airport. Again, you can impose requirements that aren't in the underlying zoning and enforce them on property within this boundary. So you can limit things that are allowed. You have zoning that allows residential uses, but the overlay can say no residential uses within certain areas. The overlay controls. It becomes the controlling document rather than the underlying zoning. Again, if there's a conflict, that conflict is resolved with the overlay district taking precedent. We have a series of slides that the airport director, Dr. Sabata, is going to go through to talk about the tapestry of plans in the area. I can still answer questions if any pop up that may relate to zoning. I will be happy to talk again at the end and give you a little more information about what we think the next steps will be. So, thank you.
Thank you, George. Robin Sabata, Airport Director. It's good afternoon, yeah. I'd like to point out that there's a few other people in the audience. We have members of our Airport Advisory Committee here, and in fact, we have, 4 members right here. So we do have a quorum and a notice of a quorum out. We also have Charlie McDermott here from Dibble Engineering, and also he is the chair of the Scottsdale Airport Advisory Committee. So he brings in 2 different perspectives that might be helpful in case there's questions. So today we're going to talk about several different plans, and I think it's important for us to be able to understand the context of the protections of the airport historically that have been in place for many years and how those plans actually overlap and work with each other. The goal at the end of this presentation is to move into an area where we can put all of these items together and eventually, through the end of this process, have a really easy, comprehensive, very transparent plan that is implemented in the community so people know what can happen in all those areas around the airport relative to all these plans and how they're all adopted and incorporated. So the first one I want to discuss is the Prescott General Plan. So there are 145 references in the 124-page plan to the airport. It's extensively integrated throughout the entire document. And one of them I thought was particularly significant. Airport land use protection must be addressed to assure the continued viability of the airport. The airport master plan, business plan, and specific area plan have been adopted to address airport land use protections and continued viability of the airport. And pointed out throughout the plan is the economic viability of the airport and the importance of it as an economic generator. Much of the land near the airport is designated for industrial and intense commercial uses and includes a significant number of the region's manufacturing and technology jobs. And in fact, 2 of the 3 biggest employers are based at or operate out of the airport. That'd be Ruger and Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. So it's an important partner. In the introduction to the general plan also, it's notable that in more practical terms, the general plan is the guide for land use decisions in the city, rezoning and new development proposals involving use permits, as well as decisions about public infrastructure, transportation corridors, annexations, and economic development must be consistent and conform to the adopted general plan. The plan was adopted and approved by the voters in 2015. This is a really wordy slide, but what's really neat about it is to look on the left-hand side and compare it to the right-hand side and see how, on the left, the general plan and its goals flow nicely into the City Council's 2022 strategic plan that they passed earlier this year. So I'd like to go down the left side and talk about what's in the general plan and what was intended for the airport. And that is to apply compatible land uses within the airport impact zones and airport area to permit continued responsible development. Really, we're looking at 3 primary important strategies in the general plan. Strategy 5.1, protect the airport from encroachment of incompatible land uses through amendments to the Land Development Code and specific area plan to reflect FAA guidelines and enforcement of land use designations, policies, and zoning designations. That is precisely what we're doing here today. We're actually looking at the implementation of the strategy that was expected back in 2015 in the voter-approved document. Strategy 5-2, establish an airport area commercial employment zoning district which does not permit residential uses. Strategy 5.3, bolster economic viability of the airport area. And Section 11.3.2, Commerce and Industry, ensure continuation of industrial commercial character of the airport vicinity, recruit businesses for commercial space near the airport, coordinate with adjacent jurisdictions for ASAP, that's Airport Specific Area Plan implementation through IGAs, intergovernmental agreements. What we have is an amazing match on the right-hand side with the City Council strategic plan. The goals and the strategies include protecting the airport from encroachment and development that would impede its airspace, create compatible zoning around the airport in collaboration with neighboring jurisdictions, evaluate land use planning and strategic land acquisition and the placement of infrastructure to incentivize compatible land use, bolster industry and business growth, and update the airport-specific area plan, airport master plan, airport layout plan, and land development code to reduce the potential for incompatible residential encroachment. Other components to the City Council's 2022 strategic plan: acknowledge and better utilize regional commodities for airport growth, seek federal, state, and regional financial support, support future commercial air service growth, and support airport safety, including the runway extension, the ARF and snow removal facility, the air traffic control tower, and improved roadway access. Clearly, as you can see on the left-hand side, the guidance was there in the general plan, and on the right-hand side, the council's strategic plan parallels that effort very nicely. I do want to point out that we have sought federal, state, and regional financial support, and in fact, as I stand here today, we've received in actual funding and commitments more than $51 million in 4.5 years on federal and state grants, and we're looking at a possibility of another $100 million in the next 6 years. This morning, I spent the day with, my team spent the day with the air traffic control relocation folks. They're here looking at sites. That would be another $20 to $30 million, and that does not include all the private investment that will likely be happening at the airport in just the next 5 years, which is pretty close, I believe, to about 35 to 40 million. We're talking about the possibility of some significant investment, and so this airport is worth preserving. So the general plan has some explanations of land use designations in section 5-7-1. The first one is under the commercial employment category. There are several commercial uses, but it's really notable that residential uses are not anticipated in this designation. CE, commercial employment, and CR, which is commercial recreational, are designated by these areas. This is the commercial employment. And I'd like to point out before we go forward, because can everybody see the airport in the middle of this map? This is the airport. These are the two parallel runways, and this is the crosswind runway right here. So this is the area north of the airport. This is Highway 89, and this is Fain Road and Pioneer Parkway going through here. And this is the golf course. So this area up here is commercial employment. Down here is commercial employment. You can see the commercial employment in the area. There is also some commercial recreation up here and here. And again, residential uses are not anticipated in this designation. Another category that's on the general plan, LUM, which is the land use map, is commercial. In commercial, residential uses of all density categories are permitted, but subject to density and buffering standards set out by the overlying zoning districts. So in this case, we look at commercial in the dark red, and if you look at commercial, it's here, around here, and over here. Now, a really significant statement. In fact, it's so significant, it's one of the few italicized statements in the entire 124-page general plan. It's this statement right here. Where specific area plans exist and where their land use designations differ or conflict with the land uses indicated on the land use map, meaning the map to the right, the specific area plans shall be deemed the more specific and shall control planning decisions. In the case of the city of Prescott, and correct me if I'm wrong, George, it's 3 different specific plans that exist?
Yes, we have 3 specific plans.
Okay, one of them is the airport-specific area plan. So what I have up here is the airport-specific area plan, so you can take a look at that. Again, centered on the picture is the airport. These are the two runways. This is the commercial service runway. This is the general aviation parallel runway. And this is the crosswind runway. For the first time, we actually see the impact zones that were mentioned in the general plan. They're off the ends of the runway, and they're shown by numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, 6 is way out here, and you can't see it very well, but it's actually a pretty big area. We're going to be talking about impact zones in a few slides. And you can see the impact zones are actually referenced. What I did is I took this area over here, and I made it big so everybody could see it. Airport impact zones. Zone 1 is considered a clear zone. For example, this is Zone 1. Zones 2 through 5, no residential uses, restricted commercial uses. Zone 6, residential and commercial uses as permitted by zoning code, no residential within the 60 L sub DN or higher. What the L sub DN stands for is day and night average sound level. And through the rest of this presentation, you may hear the term DNL. They're the same thing. It's a measurement of sound energy, and we'll be discussing that and how that is measured around airports. In addition, you'll notice to the left, the commercial employment one we saw on the previous slide, that was in hash mark. That's this entire area in pink, and it does pretty much match the general plan. Commercial recreational. You see it down here, and it matches, and behind this airport impact zone pop-out is another piece. This is a very interesting point here. Under commercial, low-intensity, non-residential uses targeted near established neighborhoods. What's important is this is a particular situation where the airport-specific area plan says non-residential uses, where the general plan had said some may be acceptable. The more predominant plan, obviously, the plan that trumps is the airport-specific area plan. So you can see it was clear. We were looking at a couple things, impact zone protections, and we were also looking at these contours. Now you'll notice it says see Figure 1 next to the 60 LDN, or otherwise known as DNL, statement. So here is Figure 1. This is also in the airport-specific area plan. Notice that the airport is in the center, 2 runways here, 1 crosswind runway here. This is from Figure 6 we just saw, and again it says no residential within the 60 LDN or DNL or higher. It's saying that this contour, you can see it, see my 60 DNL contour, this is the 60 contour, showing a noise exposure level around the airport. On the right-hand side, it mentions the airport noise overlay. 60 to 60 for DNL is represented by this curve right here. And again, it says no residential within the 60 DNL or higher. It was very clear that there was no envisionment of any residential to be anywhere within these noise levels. The second thing we were looking at is impact zones. We've now moved to another document. We've reviewed the general plan. We've reviewed the airport-specific area plan. Now we're moving into the airport master plan. The airport master plan was actually written in 2009, and there was a specific appendix that was generated as part of that master plan process. What had happened is across the country, the FAA was seeing that proper land use was not being done around the airport. Airports are required to comply with grant assurances that do assure proper land use, compatible land use around the airport. So they paid for a plan to be developed for Prescott, and it's called the Land Use Plan. That land use plan had a number of elements. It used a layered approach to consider interior sound level, land use density and open space, safety concerns relating to pilots, passengers, the community. It considered obstructions, and it considered aircraft that were in trouble, emergency needs. The impact zones were created, It is notable that before these impact zones were created, the airport-specific area plan did have a protection corridor that was 1 mile wide and 3 to 5 miles long that largely prohibited residential. This was actually a little bit of a reduction because this one now specifically looked at NTSB crash data, and historic data was used to develop impact zones. These zones are widely adopted by airports throughout the country. Sometimes they're called safety zones, sometimes they're called crash zones, sometimes they're called impact zones. But they're meant to limit damages caused by an aviation accident, to protect airport viability, to limit noise and overflight impact on residential or sensitive communities. This land use plan also updated the noise contours, 55 and 65 DNL noise contours. I'll show you those contours in a few moments so you can visualize those better. It also provided a land use compatibility matrix. It contained impact zones, noise contours, and density references, so you could put them all together and say what's allowed in each zone and what type of land use is, and there were certain other restrictions. Also included was a special section on the ranching parcels west and north of the airport. In fact, they were listed parcel number by parcel number, and they also had a land use compatibility matrix that was disclosed at that point. The goal of the land use plan was to have a plan that was mutually agreeable to the airport and to the city, and that was adopted by council in 2011. So here's those impact zones. Again, we're still in the airport land use plan looking at these. Land use considerations include safety impacts, obstructions, density, noise and overflight, wildlife. In this case, the impact zones were specifically drawn with NTSB data, and I was able to identify the specific percentage of impacts in each of the impact zones based on that NTSB data and a relative risk level associated with each of those impact zones. Remember, even in Zone 6, there is risk, it's considered lower. You'll notice that 18 to 29% of all accidents happen in Zone 6, but the risk level is still low, and that is because the percentage is high because they're over a lot of square acres or whatever, that, you know, the size of the Zone 6 is so much bigger than the rest of the zones that even though it contains 18 to 28% of the impacts, the risk level is still low because it's such a wide area where the impacts occur, okay? At Prescott Regional Airport, we've had approximately 86 impacts since 1928, so about one a year. Some more in some years, some in other years. We did have some open houses about a month ago, and we did disclose to these neighbors these impact zones, and it was really well attended and really well received, and many of the folks in this room were there and really appreciated that. So here's the impact zones up here on a land use compatibility matrix that was included in this planning document. You'll see that Zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are across the top. And down the side, it refers to the type of activity or use, the land use. I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that the land use plan compatibility table shows all these allowances, and they show with a P which ones are permitted, and with an N which ones are not permitted. We will be generating a chart very similar to this as we go through the code update. It'll be something like this that's easy to reference. Certain uses are considered non-compatible because of overflight, like residential, schools, churches. Those existing non-compatible uses will be considered legal non-conforming, and they may continue indefinitely. But new non-compatible uses will not be permitted in selected zones. Of particular note is that residential had a caveat in the land use plan. And what the caveat is, because it's real small right here, it says no residential in, you can see N, all these residential categories, no residential in zones 1, 2, and 3. But it did say in 4, 5, 6 it was permitted, but only if it's outside the 55 DNL contour. That's further out. So what I wanted to point out is a lot has been happening while these plans have been in place. And that is, we went through a significant peak in annual aircraft operations. I have the operations here at the airport, takeoffs and landings, that's what this is, from 1990 all the way through until 2021. Note that the highest amount of activity that we have had historically at an airport occurred in 1997, in which we reached more than 353,000 total operations. You'll notice over time, though, what happened is that there was a downturn. This was a result of a couple things. One is there was a glut of pilots, and so there was a reduction in the amount of flight training that was done. Also, the university had made some decisions to build the Daytona Beach campus and build up those student population numbers as opposed to Prescott. And so Prescott's population numbers went down at that time. So there was a downturn in which it got down to about 225,000 total operations. That sounds like a big decrease, but it still made us one of the top 50 busiest airports in the country. So it's kind of interesting. It sounds like you've really lost a lot of traffic, but it's still quite busy. You'll notice that this is when, in 2000, when the Airport Specific Area Plan was formed. And then there wasn't a lot of activity until 2008 or 9 when we did the plan I just showed you, the land use plan. And then there's a series of major events below that are shown in the chart below this. During the time that a lot of the development down here at the bottom happened, it was in the lowest periods of time in airport activity in the history of the airport's last 40 years. What we're seeing now is a dramatic uptick. The total operations last year went from 235 here to 311,000 operations. I've received the projections from the flight training institutions. We're looking at a 14% increase next year and an 11% increase for the next 2 years after that. There's a likelihood that within 3 to 5 years, we will be somewhere between 380 and 400,000 operations, making us amongst the top 5 busiest airports in the country. The airport at that point would reach its airport service volume maximum. So about 400,000 is about all we can take with the current configuration and the runway, the infrastructure that we have. What's important is a number of actions happened during this time that did take away some of the strength or power of the Airport Specific Area Plan, and that is something we're living with today. As we move through this code change, we need to make sure that the strength is there to continue to protect this facility. This is what we've submitted to the FAA, and they approved it as of about a week and a half ago. We've got the official stamped approval. This is the airport property map. In order to facilitate protection of key areas that we showed you on the previous slides, we do show a land acquisition targeted for this area and this area. Again, this is the main runway, this is the parallel runway, and this is the crosswind runway. This is the area in yellow that was acquired through the AED deal. This is the area yet to be purchased, 131 acres. In pink are other acquisitions that have been completed. And in green are other future acquisitions, including an area up here which is considered the borrow site, which means the fill site, where we will be obtaining fill to do basically take a hill, turn it upside down, and fill in the length of the runway all the way out here as we extend the runway. So George and I agreed at this point to keep everybody awake. We all just kind of shake our hands and kind of take a moment. I don't know if anybody needs a break or anybody wants to.
Agree to the handshake.
Okay. So do we want to take a little break, or do you want me to keep on going? What do you want? To keep everybody fresh, or we?
I'd say keep going.
Okay. All right. So drum roll, please.
Proceed.
These are the noise contours that were generated from 2021 actual data. What that means is we actually had flight data that the FAA collected from its database of actual flight tracking. So instead of a traditional noise contour, which is usually modeled based on the mix of the airplane or the number of operations, this is modeled on actual data. These are the noise contour levels that I've been discussing. So down here, as you get closer to the airport, it's noisier. This is your 75 DNL contour. That's the one in purple. 70 DNL contour, so it gets a little less noisy as you push out. 65 DNL contour, 60 DNL contour, and 55 DNL contour are also shown here. What's important in this picture here is that you know that the FAA has previously stated that there is absolutely no compatibility in putting homes inside what's referred to as the 65 DNL contour. And I have a memo here from the U.S. Department of Transportation, FAA, in which they have written a letter to the city of Phoenix about the Tempe Entertainment District. While we're going through our own maturing, they're going through their own maturing as an airport and encountering some land use challenges as well. The difference is Tempe is outside their jurisdiction. The FAA standard for outside versus inside is if it's inside your jurisdiction and you have the power to control it, you should control it. If it's outside your jurisdiction, you should engage in intergovernmental agreements and try to control it, which they did with an agreement with Tempe, but they don't hold you to the same standard. So the FAA said in its letter to the city of Phoenix, it's important to understand that the FAA does not support residential development within areas experiencing aviation-related noise levels of DNL 65 or greater. FAA considers areas exposed to aviation noise levels of 65 dB or greater to be non-compatible with residential use. However, the responsibility for determining acceptable and permissible land uses and the relationship between specific properties and specific noise contours rests with the local authority. They highly encourage local communities to consider the fact that while sound insulation treatments, if you decide to go that route, can be incorporated into residential structures, residents will still continue to experience aviation noise levels at or above 65 dB while attempting to enjoy outdoor activities and opening their windows. Ultimately, it also cautioned that a lot of the basis for the 65 cutoff as a threshold of significance for unacceptability had to do with research that was done in the 1970s. There is no newer research that suggests that no surprise, that people do feel that noise outside of the 60 DNL can disrupt their everyday lives and be harmful. In this picture, I also show the impact zones. And I am also showing something referred to as the airline one-engine inoperative departure splay. What this means is when an airline goes to take off, it has to calculate what might happen if it has to go without one engine. In that case, there is no way you can mitigate an obstruction that it could potentially run into. If they cannot mitigate the obstruction, then the airline must reduce weight on board the plane. Right now, the Los Angeles flight, when it leaves in the afternoon during the summer, cannot sell every single day between 20 and 25 seats because our runway length, combined with the heat and the elevation, almost a mile, makes it impossible for them to take off fully loaded. If we do not control the area at the end of the runway, the health, safety, and welfare of the community is at risk because of the fact that we may no longer be able to have access to commercial air service if those obstructions are not mitigated. So you see three major things that we're considering: the impact in noise and unacceptable or non-compatibility, the airline splay, and those impact zones at the end of the runway are all shown in this diagram. So let's talk just a little bit about sound measurement. Sound is usually measured as a single event, but that event ends up getting averaged over 24 hours when you use a community measurement methodology, which is an aggregation of several events. So here's an event shown up here on the right. This is like a minute, and this is where that event occurred. Right here is over an hour where that event shows up. And then ultimately, this is your daily dose of noise. And that's essentially how the FAA calculates impact. The FAA measurement methodology is referred to again as the day and night average sound level. It does incorporate a 10 decibel penalty for nighttime operations between 10 p.m. at night and 7 in the morning. What it doesn't incorporate is a differential between the ambient noise level of an urban environment versus a rural environment. So quite different. We'll talk about that in a second. So the FAA uses a design tool that creates these noise exposure maps. This is modeled traditionally, not actual noise, except in our case, we actually have the latest and greatest, which actually includes actual aircraft flight data, which is amazing. Back in 1980, though, when the FAA had to make the call, where is the level of significance? Should we set it at 65, 60, 55? There were two schools of thought. EPA came out with a document referred to as the levels document in 1974, and they said where the cutoff should be is 55 DNL. That allows a reasonable margin of safety from people being harmed by noise. HUD, Housing and Urban Development, said they were using a 65 DNL cutoff, the threshold of significance between normally acceptable and normally unacceptable for residential occupancy. The FAA only had so much money allocated to it by Congress. It looked at the two and said, we'd like to do a reasonable margin of safety, but we can't afford it. They adopted the HUD land use compatibility guidelines as a practical, feasible, significant threshold, but they will be the first to tell you that it is insufficient for determining noise perception in the community. Many communities have threshold levels set at 60 or 55, and in fact, entire states do have 60 as a measure. The FAA claims quite a bit of progress on the number of people that have been reduced in significant noise levels. Back in 1990, there were like 7 million impacted, and now it's down to 400,000 a day. One of the big things that the FAA called to the attention of the city of Phoenix in their letter is they would like to ensure that the city of Tempe, in this case, recognizes the results of the FAA's Neighborhood Environmental Survey. These results, when compared to the Schultz curve, a tool that was developed in 1992, and in fact, it was actually developed in the 1970s and then updated in 92, revealed that a substantially higher number of people were highly annoyed over the entire range of aircraft noise levels. Here are the curves up here, but the most important part of this slide is right here. At 55, 60, and 65, this is the percentage under the old Schultz curve upon which the 65 DNL was predicated, saying that only 12.3% of all people within the 65 DNL were highly annoyed. A few years ago, the FAA said, we've got so many complaints, there's something wrong with the Schultz curve. So what they did is they did the National Environmental Neighborhood Survey, and what they found, and it was just released within the last year, that in fact, their 95% confidence level survey indicates that if you live in the 65 DNL, 65.7% of the people living there will be highly annoyed. What does that mean? It means they will be likely called to action against any future development, expansion of the airport. Even if we use the 60 DNL as a level of threshold, approximately half will be highly annoyed. And if we use the 55, a third will be highly annoyed. This is important because one of the decisions we'll have in front of us today is where is the level for our community? So what are some of the problems using the 65 DNL? The Schultz curve looks like it was wrong. DNL averaging hides loud events, so the methodology is rough. This is a big one, though. Ambient background noise levels differ in urban versus rural settings. We're not Phoenix. What might be okay in Phoenix at 65 DNL next to Luke Air Force Base, is that what we want for Prescott? The average decibel reduction, or I should say decibel increase to factor in rural is somewhere about 10%. The term is called normalization. You normalize the noise curve for the community you're in. There's something up in Grand Canyon called natural quiet, and there's actually a 20 decibel reduction when you're looking at what the ambient noise level is. So this is a really important factor. Also, I'd like to point out in Prescott, there's a long history of protecting all the way down to the 55 in the land use plan back to 2008, and the 60 in the airport specific area plan as far back it was mentioned in 2001. So I think we really need to look at that. And then also, because of the expansion that's happening in terms of aircraft traffic, I think it's completely reasonable, and I'm going to go back here, it's completely reasonable to expect that this 65 DNL contour is going to be expanding into the 60. The 60 is going to be expanding into the 55. So we're doing the forecast analysis over the next month, and then after that, we are going to rerun the noise contours for 5 years from now to see where these contours are going to expand so we have a better idea. Bottom line is we've gone through several different protections and assessments, not to mention the FAA's base evaluation, which is initial height limits. We've looked at impact zones, noise contours, one engine departure, the basic airspace evaluation that the FAA does. If a person comes to you and says, hey, I got the FAA approval, know that there are multiple layers that need to be looked at. The FAA initial height approval is not the only one. We also have several easements and disclosures. We've got an easement required in the airport influence area. The public disclosure map is a requirement by the state, and a fair notice disclosure is required in some development agreements right now, but we think it should be codified. There's other things that we want to take into account: smoke, lights, solar fields because of glare, drones, wildlife attractants, and of course, the consideration of development agreements. So this is the FAA evaluation in case you wanted it. It does not consider the OEI's requirement for the airline. It doesn't require aircraft. It doesn't evaluate aircraft in trouble like the impact zones does. It doesn't look at noise and overflight and impact on humans. And it also doesn't take into account local land restrictions. This is the FAA base evaluation. So, George.
Sorry about that. Sounded kind of like Matt Padraki's microphone move. One of the reasons that we propose the AVO, the Airport Vicinity Overlay, is that it provides zoning level protections, something that we haven't had. We have a number of plans. Plans have recommendations. Plans are supposed to guide decisions. Plans call for things to happen. Zoning is the thing that happens. Zoning creates a situation where we have police power to enforce it. You have no police power to enforce the general plan's recommendations. You have with an AVO, with an airport vicinity overlay. The AVO will provide mapped boundaries, and that boundary will change a little bit from what we've talked about probably at the beginning of this process, because I think we need to include other areas. You saw, I'm going to go back one, you saw how much of an area is covered by the FAA's requirement for the very basic height determinations, that green circle, not quite a circle. It'll lay out the requirements and the allowances for uses just like the zoning code does everywhere else in the city of Prescott. Very explicit. We have, at least on the planning commissioner side, you have a very straightforward approach to things. You can or you can't. They're listed in the code. It'll provide clear explanation of what the zones are and why the impact zones matter. That will be taken from the existing documents and converted a little bit to match the language of zoning codes. We're going to explain what certain requirements are that are currently not necessarily requirements, like the fair notice disclosure. I should know that I'm buying property near the airport. Okay, that can be taken in two different ways. I should know that I'm buying property near the airport, but I should be told that I'm buying property near the airport, and that's what the fair notice disclosure is. The additional protections for critical airspace, that would include things like that one engine inoperative takeoff path that the airport director showed you on one of the maps previously, so that it's clear that we have issues associated with protections in that area that are going to involve height more than maybe in other areas. We're also looking at the grant assurances The city's received a lot of money from the federal government. The federal government does not give money without strings attached. Those strings are grant assurances in this case. In every case that we get federal money, there are strings attached. In this case, it's a lot of money, and we need to protect that investment that we've made and the investment that the federal government has made in our airport. And we need to look at the future. What happens with the airport as it expands? What happens to development in the area as it tries to encroach? Because unfortunately for us, the flattest property left to build in Prescott is near the airport, and that is an attractant to developers. You want to build where it's the easiest to build? It's near the airport. More reason for us to try to protect it based on these requirements. So we were going to talk a little bit about possible actions, future actions for council, but I think we want to ask if you have questions and see if we can answer questions first, and then we'll work into this as the last step.
Yes,
let's start
thank you.
I'm sorry.
I'd like to make a comment,
Excuse me.
Mr. Mayor.
You're not recognized. So we will start with comments, concerns, or questions. Mayor Pro Tem, go ahead.
Thank you. It's always awkward trying to jump in when you're Zooming. I'd like to say that these AVOs are nothing new. They've been around since the 60s. They're very commonly used tools for enforcing public safety and to protect future residential development from adverse noise and to ensure compatible land use. I see that there's two parts, the OEI impact zones and then the noise contour protection zones. And I think that I'd like to ask Robin, I assume that if this is adopted, the existing structures will be okay. They'll just be considered non-conforming.
And actually, that applies to both of us. In terms of the areas around the airport, the existing obstructions have already been factored in to all of the, for example, the runway extension study and the baseline for that. So that's good news. And then, George, do you want to address
The existing uses that are in place in the vicinity of the airport, the residential uses that may be in close proximity or within those boundaries we would not allow new, are protected under zoning. They are considered a legal non-conforming because they were legal at the time they were developed. And we would allow them to continue based on zoning unless there was some reason to take action. As long as the property owners continue the use, they can continue that use indefinitely.
Okay, and then my next comment is, now, in the meantime, if final plats have been approved, then they must be allowed, right? In this area?
That one's going to take a little more consultation with our legal department before we say yes to that. Plats give a development potential, but we haven't issued building permits in some of those cases, and the actual building permit is also a permission. So if you don't have a property, if you don't have a house in an impact zone now, but you have a plat that creates a lot for a house, can we say you can't build a house because you're in an impact zone? It's going to take some consultation with our legal folks to answer that one.
Okay, and then my next comment is these land development code changes only apply pretty much going forward. They're not retroactive in a nutshell.
That's correct in almost every case.
Okay, and then will this also codify height restrictions on things like windmills, cell towers, and other airport hazards, or is that going to have to be separate?
We have written in some limitations already to the draft that we're working on, but there's a lot more work to be done on that draft. So we anticipate including height restrictions for certain areas, and we may include the height restrictions specifically by impact zones, for instance.
Okay, and then
Can I address that one, Councilmember
thank
Russo?
you.
Okay. In addition, there may be layers. So there's the base FAA height evaluation, but in the case of the one-engine departure, it will require, it's a slightly different area that's being studied based on their FAA-approved splay. So there may be multiple layers of height restrictions that could be in that decision.
Okay, and then I'd like to move on to when someone
Mayor Pro Tem?
purchases. Pardon?
You can ask some other questions after the other members of
Oh,
the council.
sorry.
and commission
Okay,
have
thank
had a
you.
chance to do so.
Thank you.
Councilmember Shishka.
Thank you, Mayor. My concern is established rights. There are established rights within the areas that we're talking about. From the standpoint of I know that Mayor Pro Tem has kind of talked about that, questioned about that, and, looking for a legal situation. But I really do have an issue with particularly the noise contours. I can certainly see Prescott investing in crash zones, in the OEI. I have an issue with, let's say, buying out established rights in noise contours. When we were at that one meeting with the people who live there on the North Course, I would question people. I'd say, look, how about the noise? Well, we live near an airport. We're expecting noise. And, what about crash zones? You're in crash zones. Well, we knew that we were living in a close proximity to an airport. So that's all a possibility. So my big question is, can we mitigate every single inconvenience that someone may have by living in close proximity to an airport?
I think that's for you.
With regard to some of the established rights you mentioned, obviously we're looking at the health, safety, and welfare of the community in these decisions. There are health impacts. There are socioeconomic impacts associated with noise. They are documented. It is a concern, and we do want to protect our citizens. In particular regards to those agreements, there are actually specific mentions not only of impact zones throughout those agreements, but also noise contour. And in fact, it is acknowledged in some of those agreements that 65 DNL is an unacceptable level for residential occupancy, residential uses. So this is nothing new. It was actually in the documents I believe you're referencing. We can talk about that more and look at those documents individually if you'd like to. The point here is that it was recognized then as being significant and important, and it is a decision-making point, and it is important now. The FAA requires that you do compatible land use such that it will ensure the continued future operation of the airport in its normal way. And if you bring in folks and put them in high noise impact areas that may have sensitivities that would have 60 to 70% of them being highly annoyed, they will likely come and oppose any future expansion of the airport, and you have failed to meet your grant assurance.
Mayor, could I go on with just one thing?
You can go into another one. Yes.
I guess I have an issue with protecting everybody from themselves. They made the decision to live in close proximity to an airport. I can see the crash zones. I can see the OEI. I have a real problem with the noise contours because you do have responsibility as a buyer to explore those issues. And I don't have any problem if you say, well, that's just not for me. And I think that we ought to, in the most cases we have, we should try and say, hey, do you realize you're living right next to an airport? But other than that, I have a real problem with any other kind of mitigation.
Okay, well, we'll go over to Councilwoman Hall.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate it. So one of my biggest questions, I have several, so I don't know if you're going off of, just asking 2 or 3 and then we move on. But if you go to page 16 on the PowerPoint presentation. We talked on this briefly, but obviously I've got concerns about near-term acquisition, or looks like 500 acres. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay. So the approximate acreage of these areas in purple add up to 362 acres. In green, this Barrow site right here in this area is 160 acres. So, and this area down here is already city-owned land, so there's no acquisition in the yellow and the pink. So I'm sorry, could you restate your question?
Well, you say near-term acquisition, and as you know, I'm from the financial background. How are we acquiring that? What is that, a purchase from the city? What will that cost? 520 acres is a lot of property. There's a lot of development. The purple on the side over here, I can see, broaches that development pretty closely.
So our airport,
given that,
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
So our airport capital improvement program does show acquisition of acreage, and that is within the next 5 years.
All right, acquisition items are off topic, so we'll have to defer your question to a more appropriate meeting where that's agendized. So do you have another question that's not related to acquisition?
Okay, yeah, I guess that's the overlay then. Maybe it's not specific to acquisition, but maybe it goes along with what Councilmember Shishka was talking about. But how many people is this going to impact? How much property is this going to impact? It seems like a pretty significant change to our land use codes. As you know, someone who's familiar with Arizona property rights, how will this impact them? How will this then in turn impact the city by us imposing this?
I'll talk a little bit about that. This is George Worley, Planning Manager. Part of the work that we're doing right now is determining what that exterior boundary should be. There are two existing boundaries that were already established in the area of the airport. One is an airport influence area boundary, which is a little closer into the airport. One is the airport-specific area plan boundary, which is a larger boundary. That airport-specific area plan boundary includes much of the area that's within the FAA's notice requirements, the height that's determination that's made by the FAA that's typically called a 7460 review. It's the form number they use. We haven't landed on a recommendation yet. That will be some of the discussion that we bring forward to Planning Commission and then ultimately the Council as to what should that exterior boundary of this AVO be. It could be the larger boundary of the airport-specific area plan, or it could be the smaller boundary of the airport influence area. Both are existing boundaries that we can use, and both have a logic behind them. It hasn't been determined yet.
Also, there's another element there, and in the current Article 5 overlay district, there is already a Table 5-2-.4, and it does identify that residential, mobile home, transient lodging, and schools are not permitted in the 65 DNL. In fact, it states land use and related structures are not compatible and should be prohibited. So this has actually been in place since 2001? 2003. This is not a new standard. The question is, that's the standard right now, is 65 DNL. The question is, since the airport-specific area plan recommended the 60 DNL, and the land use plan recommended the 55 DNL. We're looking at that in this location. So this is the current standard. This is the area between the current standard and the airport-specific area plan, and this is the area between the current standard and the land use plan. What's particularly important is this contour reflects 311,000 operations. It is logical that when the new demand forecast analysis is completed and the new noise contours for 5 years from now are run, you will see this 65 migrate toward the 60. So when you follow the airport-specific area plan of 60, as it was referred to as a buffer, then it is this area to expand into that buffer zone. So that's what we're discussing here is you can refer to this as a buffer, but what it actually may be is the 5-year 65 DNL contour period, which would then be obviously protected. Now, the FAA requires that you calculate current and future, because it's a future operation of the airport. So doing the extra work to generate the 5-year noise contour will actually help inform us where that 65 will end up and what needs to be protected.
Very good.
So, Robin, my question is not related to the noise contours. My question is related to us imposing this vicinity overlay map and how it will affect the people who are not currently impacted by a vicinity overlay map. And maybe that's something that George might be able to answer, but is it a little bit of space? Is it a lot of space? It concerns me on this acquisitions that's referred to on page 16. So how much of an impact is it going to have to our actual property owners in the area?
Potentially, it can include a much larger area. I think some of the confusion that has occurred associated with noise impact zones and various decisions have been made in the past has been that as you measure them over time, the measurement results in different contours. In this particular case, the latest request was for an actual measurement and not a modeled measurement. And as you can see, it covers a significantly larger area than what was in place in 2001 when the airport-specific area plan was done. The 65 contour was basically at the airport boundary because it was modeled and not measured. So we have new data that has moved that line out. Because that line has moved out, we're looking at a larger area that we may want to protect, not just from noise impacts, but from other impacts that can affect the airport. It's been mentioned that vegetation growth, height of structures, all of those things can impact operations in the vicinity of the airport. So the larger the zone, perhaps the better the protection. We're also looking at the possibility that if we pick a larger zone, that we're being perhaps more fair in identifying an area that will have future impacts that doesn't have impacts today. So we're looking a little further out, sorry, I'm a planner, looking a little further out than even the 5-year term that may affect the noise contours, as you just heard from Robin.
Thank you, George. I mean, one of the things that we have to recognize, if we are going to have an airport that has sustained and growing capacity and operations, then we have to rely, and we have, on FAA grants to be able to expand this without having to pay the full price ourselves. If we don't want to impose these overlays, then we have to accept the fact that our airport will no longer operate and grow. So we have to decide whether we want to support this airport and its economic activity and driving. And when we apply for grants from the FAA, we have to assure the FAA that we are going to make sure that obstructions and compatible land use are put into effect and will be in effect over the course of those grants and expansions. So that's the fundamental decision we have to make. And if we're concerned about people that have lived next to the airport for 30 years or something, obviously they're aware of it. A lot of those people acquired property before these impact zones were even defined. They didn't even exist before. But we have to think about where we're going in the future and then make the best decisions to protect the airport and fully disclose to those residents what the impacts would be when they acquire or rent properties there. So that's why we've been dramatically asking for the abrogation easements from the original property owners, from the developers, from the builders, and then the people that actually buy and occupy the properties. So I think we're making progress in that area, but we still have more to go so that those people who are impacted are fully aware of what the impact will be. Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. I think this question is for you, George. You had mentioned existing non-conforming use would be allowed to continue that use. And I guess my question is, what does that mean in terms of some of like the existing homeowners that exist in this overlay? Are I guess my question would be, if someone owns a home and they do a significant remodel to that home, is that continuing that use? Where do we draw the line with continuing that use?
Uses are defined differently than structures. So a single-family home is a single-family home, whether it's 1 story or 2 stories, or whether it's 1 bedroom or 4. Continuing the use would be a single-family home. The other controls that we've talked about might affect things like adding another story because you have height limitations, whether it's overlay height limitations or basic zoning limitations. The existing use of the property as a home, as a business, as a restaurant would be allowed to continue, and that's something that's been established through case law on zoning for decades. So that use would stay. Additional limitations may come into play on what you can do with the building, the land, or in some cases, even the vicinity around it, through the overlay district.
Got it. Thank you.
Councilman Moore.
Thank you, Mayor. This question is probably for Robin, but it occurs to me that perhaps some of the challenges we're facing is because of how our airport is being used and operated, if I could explain what I mean. If I were to make an analogy between the Prescott Airport, for example, and Sky Harbor, I see Sky Harbor as being a destination airport. Planes come in straight, they land, they take off straight, and they're gone. Whereas in this scenario, we have planes that the operation, the major operation that is being used at our airport is a training facility, not a destination airport. And so we have all this air traffic that's coming and going over and over and over again in this airport area, and not traffic taking off and it's just gone and out of our area, and it's not a problem. And so I think we have a different issue because we have a different scenario in how our airport is being utilized in our community. It's really more of a training facility, and it's creating this problem with these DNLs and this noise. And I was wondering if there's another way to address that issue, because I think that's affecting a lot of landowners and a lot of potential homes or other uses. And there obviously, it would be nice if Embry-Riddle was a part of this conversation, because they're obviously the major player with all those flights that you're talking about, the 300,000, 400,000 flights. I would suspect that 90% of that is Embry-Riddle.
It's about 75%.
Only 75?
Yeah, and about 75% of the traffic stays in the pattern. The normal airport, about 15 to 20% of the traffic would stay in the pattern. This is the busiest collegiate flight training location in the United States. They surpassed University of North Dakota and the Daytona Beach campus in the last 2 years. So it is a very busy. There are 950 pilots expected to be in training in the fall. The average direct infusion from that student is $50,000 per student. So this fall, it's going to be $47,500,000 in direct infusion into our local economy associated with that flight training program. So it's a really important economic generator for our community. That having been said, can we be a good neighbor? Absolutely. I think that that's an important part of this. And one of the things we discussed with the runway extension is that an ancillary benefit to that, not only it will help the air carrier be able to fill the seats, give us more frequency, more destinations, but when you actually take off further out, let me show you. When you actually take off here, 80% of the traffic goes to the west, to the southwest. So when you're taking off from here, then by the time you get over to some of these sensitive areas, the good news is that they'll be higher. There'll be separation, more separation between the aircraft flying over and the folks on the ground, the sensitive uses. So we do see that the runway extension is actually a benefit to the community. It's a big benefit. I did want to point out one other benefit, and as much as we don't like seeing these noise contours getting bigger like this, as long as you maintain compatible land use, protect these contours, protect the crash zones, the FAA will help to interior sound level mitigate homes that were in here before those rules were known. So we will, according to the FAA in their letter to the city of Tempe, they said that the airport sponsor would be eligible to receive FAA Improvement Program funding for remedial noise mitigation for residential properties that were there prior to the non-compatible development. So that's an advantage to those homeowners. They would maybe have windows, doors, and other replacements they'd be eligible for.
But I think what we're looking at really, and what we're talking about today, is we're trying to prevent growth and development in these areas, not so much trying to go back and fix something, because currently there aren't too many homes yet in this area. And what we're really talking about today is an overlay so that we prevent homes from being in this area. We're not talking about that benefit.
The idea, though, is if we do this overlay, we then are eligible for those homeowners getting that relief. And for them, that may be very important. Just to let you know, the average.
On the right side of the dais?
Yeah, how about the right side of the dais?
You have a question?
I'd like to make 2 points. One, I really welcome this presentation, because on the Planning Commission, when we make a decision, we need to know what's in, what's out. And if I were to draw a comparison, if I'm on the tee box and I look down the fairway and see white stakes, then I know that if I slice and go out of bounds, I get penalized. But in the airport fairway, we've got white, and we got yellow, and we got pink, and we got green. So somehow or other, we need to bring that together in one comprehensive plan so we know on the Planning Commission, because we get presented in the last meeting, I voted no, because I said I'm not clear what's going on at the airport. We're going to get 1 month, we'll get a proposal that's out by the airport, and then 4 months later, we'll get another proposal. And we evaluate those case by case, but we need to connect the dots and make sure it's part of a comprehensive plan. Now, I'm more concerned about the future than I am about the houses that are there, because, you know, our past commissioner, Mabrak, has said, well, I live there and I like it. You know, years ago, when Eisenhower came back from World War II and he fell in love with Hitler's Autobahn, he built the interstate system. It was a great invention, got people out of the city, got them in the suburbs, put them in cars, killed the train business in America. Well, there's another move afoot right now against the internal combustion engine, and that's to go to electric. Well, when you go to electric, you take away the ability to drive from here to Peoria, Illinois, basically. So I suggest that means there's going to be more airline business than less, because you can't drive your EV to Phoenix, park it for 2 weeks, and expect it to be charged when you return. So we need to look at the future of the Prescott Airport, because I suggest it's going to get bigger rather than less. So I strongly suggested that we put together a task force and look at this airport with all the overlays and somehow try to integrate it into one, so when it comes before the Planning Commission, we can say, that fits planning, that fits zoning, it doesn't. Thank you.
Well, I think being able to adopt this AVO would achieve the vast majority of your concerns, Mr. Gambogi. Any other comments, Susan?
Susan Graham. The areas that are being looked at for acquisition, are they areas that would allow for commercial and industrial development?
Again, we're off topic here. Acquisition is not a subject for this this meeting.
If I could just address why real quickly.
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Joe.
So as you look at the various proposals, and you'll be making decisions about it, you've already heard that legal non-conforming uses stay. And so there is some question that has to be made, and it's not by you, about what is a legal non-conforming use and what isn't. And then if there is a legal non-conforming use, a decision will have to be made about whether to acquire that land or not acquire that land. So it's really outside the scope of what you have to worry about. So, and it's not really what was noticed today. So that's why I just don't want to get into the acquisition side of things. If that makes sense.
Tom?
Thank you, Mayor. I have three things I'd like to say. The first one is talking about noise and overflight. When Paul Daly was the chancellor at Embry-Riddle University, just before he became mayor, he would get calls every day from Mitzi Wells, because the planes would fly right over her house all the time. So we're very familiar with noise, and God bless her, she was a great lady. Two other things. One, we're looking at the layers of the DNLs going all the way out and changing, and they're going to change, and they're going to get bigger, and as you said, and what have you. Is there a possibility that the uses that happen in those areas could be layered? As you get further away from the airport, maybe certain things are allowed, and then as you get closer to the airport, certain things are not allowed.
So part of what the AVO will do is to create something like you see up here. It's similar to what we have in our zoning code. In certain districts, you're allowed certain uses. This will create districts based on the impact zones or noise contours.
Okay.
That will say within these districts you can do certain things. The proposal that we're looking at right now, though, is to look at the clicking too fast, that 55 DNL zone as a boundary for residential uses. Inside the bright yellow line, no residential uses. It doesn't necessarily stop you having other uses, and those other uses, as you get closer and closer to the airport, will get more and more restricted. Almost as an example of how perhaps an inverse version of that pyramid I showed you, of as you go from single family to commercial, you get more and more uses allowed. As you get closer to the airport, you go back down to less and less uses. They will be uses that don't allow residential. They will be uses that maybe reduce certain types of commercial uses as you get closer, because the impacts are worse for certain types of uses, whether it's noise or an actual impact zone. We don't necessarily want to put a movie theater in an impact zone that's fairly high impact zone, zone 2 or 3. We may want to allow a manufacturing plant, though, because the area is larger, and that's a possibility. So that's something that you'll see laid out in table format that you can easily evaluate as you move forward.
Thank you. Last thing, Mr. Mayor, if I can. What will the AVO do? How will it improve the existing fair notice disclosures? The ability for people to know. I mean, the big issue is that when you buy land there, if you're the third or fourth buyer down the road, you need to be able to have some level of notification and assurance that, yeah, this house was built in 1990 and it's in this particular zone. And how is the AVO going to help improve notifying that owner?
Probably by two ways. One, it's incorporated into the code. Anyone who does any kind of good background research on a location that they're purchasing, I'm looking at all of those real estate agents out there, it's in the code that says that will be required, that you have to provide that fair notice disclosure. The other is it's in a zoning code. Right now we have recommendations for it. We have a lot of things that say you should do these things. But the problem we have is that it's hard to enforce unless it has a police power behind it. Again, we're back to the situation of the overlay district makes it zoning and therefore a police power of the state. So we can enforce it. We can say, well, you sold this property or you showed this property and you failed to disclose something that's required by law to disclose. And the real estate agents are responsible for that. So I think those are the two ways to do it. One, it's zoning and police power. And two, we've codified it in something that everyone will have access to, whether they read it or not. It's available.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Mayor Pro Tem. She's been waiting for her additional question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would like to just add on to what Mr. Worley just said. Another element that's very important in the AVO is the noise disclosure statement when escrow is opened. And it should also include a disclosure concerning airport activity. And it's important that that be codified, because currently I think there's a footnote about the airport on some subdivision map that was done way back when, which the purchaser will never see. And also, I'd like to ask Robin, I assume this AVO will be submitted to the FAA for review?
They do have a noise compatibility officer, and we had the benefit of the city manager and the mayor and I meeting with the FAA team, and they were most impressed with what we were proposing that we would be doing. And that's what really is driving us to knowing we're doing the right thing. It was a very successful meeting. Wouldn't you agree, Mayor?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to go back to Councilwoman Hall and then come back to you, Don. Councilwoman Hall?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate it. I just would like to say something to clarify. My questions are not about not being in support of the airport. Of course, I support the airport, but I also support our property owners and building homes during a time that housing is desperately needed. And we need to be very clear that even though we're discussing this overlay, we do not own all of this property within this overlay zone that we're imposing. So it's really important that we think about the implications and the repercussions that could happen by making these changes to property owners that were previously not in place. So I guess one of my questions, it seems obvious to me there's been a lot of growth at the airport with regards to residential housing. So do we have any idea whether it's our current agreements or existing applications or existing plans about how many homes will be impacted, whether they're cannot proceed with construction or a density change, or they're relocating, that is already approved to be put there that we would then be putting in an overlay zone for?
Could I maybe make a comment? I'll start.
It's 12 questions within one question, but go ahead.
I got it in, though.
One of the things you bring up is how many potential homes might be impacted, and to be quite frank, with the approach to zoning that we have with the flexibility, no one can tell how many homes ultimately might be built. There isn't a finite number in terms of under these impacted areas. And there is additional area outside of these impacted areas where those homes could be built without any sort of impact on airport operations. So the question is, obviously, if there's enough flexibility in this model to be able to assure the future protection of the airport and still leave additional land use layers that are effective and profitable to the owner and highest and best use in many cases. Okay?
And I was going to take a wild stab at 15,000.
Did you say 15,000? I'm sorry.
Based on the approved subdivision plats that are in the area that potentially are impacted by the proposed or the current 55 DNL. Again, we haven't landed on that as the boundary, but that seems to be the direction that staff's going to recommend to you. You have about 10,000 in Deepwell Ranch that are allowed by the development agreement. Of that, probably 1,000 or so are outside of that area. And then the remainder of the the AED properties and Granadell's Estates and other properties around there add up to another 1,000 or so lots. So I think it could be anywhere between 10 and 15,000 that could be impacted. Again, as Robin pointed out, doesn't mean we're prohibiting them. It means we may move them away from the airport further and potentially have to look at some other alternatives.
But when you say move them away from the airport, you mean on the land that they already own?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
You want to run by your arithmetic again? I think your two descriptions came up to a couple of thousand, so expanding that to 15 seems like a broad expansion.
The Deepwell Ranch master plan allowed for up to 10,000.
Right.
And then an additional 1,000, 1,500, 1,600, sorry, I'm counting. I don't normally do that in the afternoon. In AED, there's another 500 or so vacant parcels in in Granadell's Estates and Walden Ranch. And then as you see, that area extends down into areas that haven't been developed at all yet. So I'm probably closer to 12.
So that speaks to your concern, Councilman Shishka. The difference between 50 and 65 is very, very, very dramatic. So finding the right number in between those two, I think, is the challenge that we have to deal with. Chairman Mickelman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. George, as we proceed down the road on the AVO, are we going to be inviting third parties in for input so we can get a broad basis to work on this?
That was our intention, and to allow additional input for you. We know how the Planning Commission generally asks for that kind of information. We will also at some point have to notify everyone affected by the AVO by mail and invite them to attend meetings. So at some point, everyone who would be impacted by whichever the smaller boundary or the larger boundary will get notification of the action that we're taking. That normally starts with your first meeting. So we do need to discuss what we're going to do as far as which boundary, because we're going to have to start mailing notices out.
I'm thinking also having the invite going out as we're determining these boundaries, not when we made a decision, let us know what you think.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it would need to be early. We also have the opportunity to invite other experts in to give information. The airport relies a lot on Dibble Engineering. We have a representative here who may be able to help provide some answers. We have an advisory committee for border committee for the airport.
Airport Advisory Committee?
Committee for the airport that you should probably consult with along the way as well.
Good.
Very good. Commissioner Hutchinson.
Oh, thank you. I have a comment and a suggestion. Comment first. I'm kind of in the wicket with Commissioner Gambogi in that when I think about the future of the airport, I can't help but consider the kinds of aircraft that we might expect to see 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. I mean, an F-35 coming in and out is a whole lot different than a Cessna 310. And a DC-10 full of fire retardant is a whole lot different than. So my comment is that have we in fact considered long-term what this might look like? And in fact, are we setting ourselves up for redoing it again because if we haven't, in fact, looked at future usage? That's the comment.
So to give you some history, the airport has never exceeded 100,000 pounds maximum takeoff weight, maximum gross takeoff weight. And in the 20-year master planning timeline that we have done, we do not envision increasing runway strength, only runway length. And we have to get our critical future aircraft approved by the FAA. And our critical future aircraft is actually an Embraer 170, 175, or CRJ 700 or 900 series. All of those are under 90 seats. We do already have 737s, limited operations, engaged by the U.S. Forest Service for firefighting operations. And we have 500 exceptions a year from the FAA to go over the 100,000 pounds maximum gross takeoff weight, and we save those for our firefighting and our emergency services aircraft. So we have looked at that. The mix of aircraft we think will remain fairly consistent. We don't expect to ever exceed more than 5% of total operations being commercial service, but we think commercial service will still be 8 to 10 flights out and in a day in the next 5 to 7 years. So,
Robin, am I right in assuming that the way we measure noise kind of understates the airplanes that really make people upset?
It's not the airlines.
we don't get complaints about the aircraft. Not that maybe somebody won't in the future, but the point is, it is the repetitive nature, which is what Councilmember Moore brought up, which it's like the mosquito over your bed at night, kind of. Yeah, it can be a bit irritating, to say the least. And it is outside of some of these areas in the 55. I'll tell you, when you look at where we get calls. Does that help you? Yes?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
May I break in here for a minute?
Of course.
Concerning the last comment, with our runway extension, the airplanes that are taking off are going to be reaching a higher altitude sooner. And then with the SAFE program, SAFE complex being planned, and if it's constructed, that will move some of those, move the Embry-Riddle touch and go training flights further north and improve the flight pattern away from the homes. If I have that correct, Robin?
I'm showing it on the map right now. If the SAFE complex, which is actually going to be occupied by multiple flight institutions over time, is put into place, obviously this will be the pattern that's used on the north runway. It does allow those institutions to use the end around and come to the south runway as well, but the idea is to equalize the operations. And also, I did want to address, if you don't mind, Councilmember Moore, one of the things that the university is exploring is the possibility of an auxiliary field to be able to divert. And right now, 40,000 operations a year go to Cottonwood. It could get to be, if we could find another alternate auxiliary field, I think we could vent off another 60 to 80,000 operations, maybe even 2 fields. This is an initiative by the university. It's a private initiative, but it could be in county area. So I think that is one of the items we need to consider. That having been said, if the continued growth is expected as we meet the needs of the pilot shortage, that's what we're doing here, of course, is meeting the needs of the pilot shortage, not only in the nation, but throughout the world. We still are going to see up to 600,000 total operations associated with the university and the flight training institutions amidst all of those locations that may eventually evolve.
How about that?
Councilman Moore.
I appreciate the additional information that you shared with us, because I think it's, to go to Tom's question, you were saying, well, in the next 5 to 7 years, we see 6 to 8 commercial flights a day. We have this airport that's doing 6 to 8 commercial flights and then hundreds of thousands of training flights. It's the type of operation that's occurring at the airport that's creating this whole scenario. It's not the airport itself. It's how we are utilizing the airport that we have. Like I said, if we had a Sky Harbor, planes would come in, land, take off, and they're out of your area of influence. And we don't have any of these issues that we're grappling with as a city. We have a very unique situation because we're kind of joined at the hip with Embry-Riddle and the flight operation and the economic impact that it has to our community. So it's a very unique situation, and I think having a secondary location would be very beneficial.
Can I add my suggestion?
Oh, do you have another comment?
I asked if I could have a comment and a suggestion.
Okay,
I
so
made
you
my
got your
comment. Can I-
comment, so you're up for your suggestion. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. Lately, I've had a lot of time on my hands, and unfortunately, our household has access to Westlaw. So I was amazed at going through Westlaw how much aviation litigation there is. And it occurred to me that the language in this AVO should be very, very broad as possible, and perhaps benchmarked by some other outside specialty law firm to make sure that this is as complete and comprehensive as possible. That's my suggestion.
Appreciate that, Commissioner. Councilman Shishka, and then I'll come back to you, Tom.
Thanks, Mayor. You know, I know we all wish that, number one, we would have had the staff to guide us years ago that we have now. But number two is that I wish we had a blank slate out there where we could say, let's just put this down and nothing will be allowed out there that we don't feel is in the benefit of the airport. But that's not reality. Unfortunately, there are established rights, for the good or bad, out in the areas that we're talking about. And my biggest concern is that mitigating financially those rights may be far more expensive than what the FAA could ever give us. So that's my issue. I think that we need to find a sweet spot. We need to really, really, really work hard to recognize all of the responsibilities that we have and that people who own land have. And, Mayor, I totally agree with you. We should absolutely protect the airport. Unfortunately, we have somewhat of a sordid history to work with.
Well, obviously, we can't correct the mistakes we made in the past, but we can do our best to recognize what they were and make sure they aren't repeated. And if there is a way to mitigate those unfortunate decisions, we certainly will try to do that. And I'll also mention another thing. A lot of the flight training was generated because of the federal government's decision to reduce, actually increase the amount of flight hours necessary for air transportation license. Went from 250 hours to 1,500 without utilizing any legitimate evidence to generate such an extreme increase in hours. So consequently, there's many, many, many more hours that flight students need to acquire before they can move into those seats. Now, you exacerbated that because the airlines decided to overreact to the pandemic and push a lot of the senior pilots into retirement. So now we have so many open necessary pilot shortages that these training programs need to try to fill. So when and if the federal government comes to their senses and realizes that we have foreign pilots flying in our airspace that have those lower hours, and we're not seeing any extreme examples of aircraft crashes or collisions. So I think there may be some reduction and reality checks in that area. And then also for the airlines to also be able to support pilot training and be able to fill the seats in their cockpits. So that is something that probably will happen, although my confidence in the wisdom of the federal government has a little bit of a cynical nature to it. Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I tend to agree with you. However, I think that trying to hope for an alternative landing site in Yavapai County, you'd probably have a better chance at getting the federal government to change their rules. Embry-Riddle's been looking at that, and the city's been looking at that for as long as I've been here, 40 years, doing it, and that ain't going to happen very soon, that's for sure. The second thing is, when you make the next presentation to us, I would like to hear more about the kinds of restrictions and structural restrictions that you're considering in the overlay plan when it's presented to the commission the next time.
When we make that presentation to you, you'll have a draft to work from. So you'll have a draft document that will outline all of those things.
Excellent, thank you.
We haven't quite landed on one to hand out for this meeting.
Thank you.
Councilman Montoya.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to throw in a quick comment. I agree with Commissioner Riley's suggestion that we look at a layered approach for land use as we move forward through this. I think that might help us navigate some of the reality of existing contracts we have to navigate and making sure that we still support the airport. So I just want to throw that comment in there.
Councilman Moore, did you have another question? No? Any further comments, questions, or suggestions? Do we have any public comment? Well, I don't know if you want to wrap this meeting up or whether I should just go straight to adjournment.
One quick slide to just talk about. If we move things forward at a rather fast pace, we would be able to present something to the Planning Commission as early as August 11th, possibly getting an action from the Planning Commission in one meeting, but more likely two, And the likelihood of having something back to council is looking more like the beginning of September to the middle of September. And that gives us an opportunity for a planning commission to see the draft of the document, to ask us questions and make recommendations as to who we should bring to their meetings, outside experts if necessary, or existing boards, commissions who may be able to help them, and then getting a recommendation from them to bring back to you.
Yeah, I think it's important that we have a pretty good understanding of what each one of these DNL boundaries are. What's the impact at 65? What's the impact at 60? What 55, 50, et cetera? Because I think we're going to have to come to a conclusion of a reasonable boundary level that makes sense for the city, for the airport's future, and then also the development around the airport, that will try to strike a reasonable balance.
And would you like to have, say, a task force, like you mentioned, or a working group that might, just in the next few weeks between now and the Planning and Zoning Commission, maybe a couple members of council, a couple members of P&Z, a couple members of AAC get together and sort of hash out some of the pieces of the AVO so they can ask the questions and we can have those questions ready for when it goes in front of the P&Z?
Well, I don't know about the rest of the group here, but I think that'd be a good idea for us to try to find it on our own.
I definitely
We're going to
agree
be
with
all over the place.
Yeah, definitely a good idea.
Sorry to burst everyone's bubble. I just want to point out that if you're going to establish a group of that nature, unless you do it as a mayoral ad hoc committee, we would need a resolution establishing a new council board. So you and I can get together and
Well, I don't know about you. I'm getting pretty good at establishing ad hoc committees.
Mr. Mayor, one other option is to pre-invite those folks that you would put on an ad hoc committee to the first presentation at Planning Commission and involve them in the discussion at Planning Commission rather than create a separate body. And I'm thinking, just based on the timeline, creating a second body may mean changes to the draft document, which is going to push everything back at least a couple of weeks and maybe a month.
Good. All right, so where do we proceed at this point?
I think you make an executive order.
Commissioner Riley.
I think, an ad hoc committee, I think of limited duration is something that's probably a very good idea. And I think that having those moving ahead in between meetings, the ad hoc committee members, that all the folks here know that time is of the essence, and that we want to move this thing forward. So it's designed to reduce the time, not necessarily expand that time. And I think that that's a good idea to do that. And I'd be willing to serve on it if you're so interested.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. So if you want a decision now, I'm going to form an ad hoc committee to address these issues and try to come up with some recommendations that we can consider and make a decision on in a somewhat rapid manner. So within the next, 2 weeks? Very good. So I guess if there's nothing further, remember what General MacArthur said. I think he said these proceedings are closed. So I'm adjourning the meeting here.
Thank you, everyone. It was a good meeting.